Hello, I'm Evan with New Life for Old Bikes. In my last episode, I showed you my polished aluminum Huffy ATB. I showed you some of its issues and what needed to be done, and in this episode, I decided I'd go a little deeper. I have a Murray, and this particular Murray is an early 90s. It was found in a garage and it's been sitting since the late 1990s. It was actually hanging in the garage. The frame has a light surface rust on it. It's actually a really nice patina, but I wanted to show you what I look for and decide whether or not this should be saved. The first thing we're going to do is verify that the rear wheel is centered in the frame. If you'll notice, the bolt that goes through the center of the brakes lines up directly over the center of the tire. The next thing to notice is that the center of the tread on the tire lines up with the center of the bolt on the kickstand. If you don't have a kickstand, just make sure it lines up with the seat tube. If your wheel is not centered in the frame, the next step is very simple. It just requires that we run a string through the dropout. The dropout is where your wheel bolts to the frame. We pull the string around the head tube. The head tube is the tube between the fork and the handlebar stem on the front of your bike. We pull the string to the dropout on the other side of the bike and tie it in exactly the same spot. Next, it's a simple matter of measuring from the seat tube to the string on each side and verifying that it's equal. If it is, your frame is fine. The next step is a simple matter of checking to make sure your wheels are true. Although these aren't perfect, they're pretty darn close. And I suspect that a lot of the problem here is simply that the spokes are loose. So I can go ahead and snug that up and resolve that problem. While we're here, I want you to notice the huge cracks in the tire. These go all the way down to the core. And unfortunately, if I took this on a very long ride, I suspect that I would have a blowout. So these tires are history. They need to be replaced. You have two options when you want to tighten a spoke. You can either use a spoke wrench. This particular one is a single size, and it simply slides down over the spoke and you can loosen or tighten it. This other one that I have has multiple sizes. Your other option is to simply use a screwdriver. If your plan is to use a flathead screwdriver, there's a slot in the top of each spoke. Just remove the tire, the tube, and the rim strip and you'll be able to get to it. Just a little word of advice here. Make sure you put a little penetrating oil on the spokes before you start to loosen or tighten them. You don't want to break these. As a general rule, I tighten or loosen my spokes with the wheel and the bike. I go ahead and tighten up my brake distance so that I can keep adjusting and truing the wheel. Let's look at the brakes. You want to make sure that the brake handle goes no more than halfway down to the bar. The other thing is you want to make sure that the caliper itself moves smoothly. Also that it moves evenly on each side. This one does. It doesn't even need an adjustment. The back brake is also in good shape. All things considered, this is pretty darn good, especially since the only thing I've done to this bike is given it a bath and used a little penetrating oil on all the moving parts. I want to spin the wheels and make sure that there's nothing crunchy or grinding. Same thing with the bottom bracket or crank and the steering. Everything feels smooth on this bike, although I know it's very dry. It hasn't been serviced since, well, the early 1990s. The last thing we're going to do is check the derailleurs and the shifters. I'm absolutely amazed how well everything works, even after sitting for as long as this has. Amazingly, after sitting over 25 years, the bike only needs tires, a set of grips, and probably a set of brake pads. Of course, you have to factor in that you will need to disassemble the whole bike and grease all the bearings. If I were doing this for a customer, it would be very hard to justify it. Likewise, if I were doing this to sell it, to flip the bike, it would be very hard to justify spending that money. If I'm doing it for myself, if I had a family member or friend that needed the bike, it sure would be a cheap way to get into another bike. And besides, the patina on it looks really cool. If this bike had been a higher end bicycle, such as a Trek, a Specialized, a Raleigh, or a Giant, this decision would have been a whole lot easier. Unfortunately, with mid-range and low-range bikes, if you have one or more components that are bad or anything damaged, the bike could potentially be a total loss. It would end up being parts. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like and subscribe.